Okay, all right. So it gives me very great pleasure to welcome Leigh Anderson back again. We're certainly putting her through her paces this conference. So this is our closing plenary, and over to you, Leigh.
Thank you, Emily, and welcome to our closing panel on diversity and inclusion. Before I ask our panelists to introduce themselves, I'd like to thank Zeynep for the honor of chairing this session in particular, and thank her, Emily, the volunteers, and the entire Data for Policy team who are behind this conference. My name is Leigh Anderson. I'm a professor at the Evans School of Public Policy and Governance at the University of Washington in Seattle, Washington. And in alphabetical order, Katie, can I ask you to begin and have the panelists introduce themselves?
Hi, thank you very much for having me on the panel. I'm Katie Atkinson. I'm Dean of the School of Electrical Engineering, Electronics and Computer Science at the University of Liverpool, UK, and I do research on AI and law.
Kamau?
Good morning and or afternoon, respectively. My name is Kamau Bobb. I am the global lead for diversity strategy and research at Google, and I'm the senior director of the Constellation Center for Equity and Computing at Georgia Tech.
Thank you. Torbjörn?
Hello, everyone. Thanks for having me on the panel. My name is Torbjörn Fredriksson. I'm working in UNCTAD, leading our work on e-commerce and the digital economy. So UNCTAD is the UN Conference on Trade Development.
Thank you. And good morning, Himanshu.
Hi, my apologies for being late. I'm Himanshu Nagpal. I'm a Deputy Director with the Financial Services for the Poor team, managing our work on financial inclusion in India with the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation.
So I have asked our panelists to think about challenges that underpin diversity and inclusion in data and policy across 3 areas: access, bias, and responsibility. So dealing with access first, we started talking about digital divides back in the 1990s. And yet more than 3 decades later, access to digital technologies are still uneven by location, by income, and by demographics. So on location, rural and remote communities may lack basic cell tower infrastructure, particularly in poorly resourced communities. So my first question to you, Himanshu, who finances this public good if limited incomes or density of local consumers make it an unprofitable private sector proposition and public finances are limited?
Thank you, Leigh, for the opportunity to address this important question. As I mentioned, I'm in the financial inclusion team, so I'll try and give this answer from that perspective and a global perspective it will be. There's a growing set of digital infrastructures that should be considered as public goods. For example, from my vantage point of financial inclusion, connectivity, digital identity, digital payments, and even access to an ability to share one's own data should be considered as public goods, and we are seeing many countries taking that approach. These need to be built with inclusivity as a first principle. I think about these as the roads of the future. It's often easy to build these infrastructure for what we call the smartphone population. It's fantastically easy for the private sector and for the businesses out there to do that. But what about the people who don't have a smartphone? We have in the financial inclusion space a huge population with still feature phones. They can't afford to have a smartphone. And how about the population which has no phone? Should they not have access to these roads or digital roads of the future, as I put it before? Who has the incentives to serve them? In some cases, private models can finance these well. We have seen that they have the sustainability and the profitability to do that. But often, more and more, we are seeing that we need either public-private partnerships or purely public sector funding, taking the lead in making sure everybody has equitable access to the most basic digital infrastructure. I think the answer to your question really is in the question, the public goods. These have to be built for all. And if they are not reaching through normal mechanisms to all, the government has to step in. I would say public sector can take the lead in financing, does not does not make them not applicable for the private sector. Private sector still has a large role to play. These digital public infrastructure need to be built in a way so that private sector can then utilize them and serve the needs of all citizens, all residents of a country. I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thanks, Himanshu. I noticed that you let the foundation off the hook there, but that's okay. So now I want to turn to income. So even in technology-rich Seattle, fewer than 50% of all elementary school kids and only 41% of English learners logged onto the public school learning portal between March and June when the school shut down because of COVID-19. So Katie, a question for you and a follow-up to Kamau as educators. How are different children's paths and opportunities shaped by access to data and tech? Are there examples of effective public policy to address these inequities?
So the term digital poverty has come to be something that we've been using a lot more around the university when we made the switch to online teaching when the lockdown happened in March. So of course, we think about the smartphone generation, but does everybody actually have the equipment available to them to be able to access the online services, whether it be in schools or whether it be in universities? And an unfortunate but perhaps useful side effect of the lockdown has been that we've been able to gather some data on this. So we now know what percentage of people haven't got access to a laptop or a home computer, or where there's shared facilities within a household. So I know universities at least have had to be thinking about, what provision do we have to make for students who can't access our material online? Is somebody going to be sat in quarantine somewhere just with their phone? And do we have some kind of safety net where we can help out with equipment for people who don't have it so that they can access the facilities? So that's in the higher education sector, but of course it's been in schools as well. So my own children had to move to online learning when we went into lockdown, and I know the schools were talking a lot about this. And again, there was some provision for people who didn't have those facilities available. And this relates back to what Himanshu was saying about making sure that there's access for all. So moving on to the policy side of what we can do about this, there's been some moves to recognise this problem. So just one example from the UK, in the 2019 UK general election, one of the political parties had in their manifesto that there was a pledge to deliver free broadband for all. So I've heard stories about people being sat in car parks around public buildings trying to access the Wi-Fi during lockdown because they haven't even got the ability to access the web. So, bold statements like that about making sure the infrastructure is there and the free broadband for all is available. There's also initiatives in schools to make sure that we've got digital natives coming out of schools as well. So there's been some changes in school curriculums, making sure that everybody comes out digitally aware and has digital skills. And we have this at the University of Liverpool as well. We've got hallmarks that we want graduates to come out with, that even if you're not studying computing, you've got basic digital literacies on top of that as well. So I think there are things that that governments can do to address those inequalities to give access to all.
Thank you. And Kamau, you're welcome to speak specifically to that question, but I also wanted to ask you, what is different about pursuing a mission of ensuring that students of color have access to power in the technology sector at a company like Google relative to the academy or even the public sector where you've also worked?
Well, first, I think we should reflect on the moment that we're in. I think that this, I guess for our colleagues around the world, if you haven't heard, the United States is ripping itself apart. So we have this extraordinary social upheaval that's going on here. And relevant to the question, in Atlanta, for example, where I live, this is the second most segregated city in the United States. And racial segregation correlates with everything. Principle among which is education. So we have a level of segregation here, again in the United States, in most of the major urban centers, that is reflective of a time when it was legal to segregate by race. And so the correlation of that with students' ability to be able to participate is expected, because the premise of making it illegal for there to be segregation was that separate is inherently unequal, particularly by race, because it makes a whole host of assumptions about which students are capable and which students aren't. And in the American story, it's obvious to say that the assumption is that Black students are incapable of high-end academic pursuits. And so the institutions of education that have been aligned with that expectation reveal the outcomes of the expectations themselves. So now that we're posed with this COVID moment, and I think that's why I wanted to pan back a bit. When we're posed with the COVID moment, we see all of that revealed plainly. For those who hadn't been paying attention all along, it might be new, but that's the reality of what we're actually dealing with. So the digital divide and the closure of it and the presumption of digital natives against that social infrastructure is a total fallacy. The digital divide never went away because there's an educational divide. So to presume that there's a digital closure on top of an educational and social divide just doesn't make sense, almost by definition. So I think the relative to the Google landscape, I would rather shift to thinking about what it means to be in highly selective post-secondary institutions and what is our ability to have equitable access to those institutions. And because, as I laid out first, that we have this kind of phenomenally, foundationally segregated system, we don't have the structural equity built into the system that enables all students to be able to participate irrespective of their abilities, ambitions, etc. So I think the charge that we have now and the responsibility of policy is a delicate one, because we don't really have laws on the books that enable the kind of social segregation that we see. So that makes the target of attack difficult to identify. This is now addressing issues of social and community attitudes about particular students and the implications of integration in ways that are meaningful. And that's an attitudinal and a cultural shift. So to close that argument, I think it reveals what I said in the beginning, that the United States is ripping itself apart. And the reason that it is because of those very attitudinal issues that we're up against. So I think Google, the public sector, are all now having to contend with where we're going to put our flag in the ground. I think that corporate entities have typically tried to be as politically neutral as they can be for obvious reasons. But the time for that, I think, has passed. So I think now we're going to need a new slate, a new set of kind of courageous positions to be taken to address the questions that you're asking, Leigh.
Thank you. Last question on this. In Bangladesh, India, and Pakistan, there are no formal laws, back to the legal versus implicit laws, preventing a woman from owning a mobile phone. Yet rates of mobile phone ownership between men and women differ by up to 50%. So Torbjörn, for you, are these technologies becoming more essential, or as these technologies become more essential as a means of communication and advancement, what is the appropriate response of the international community when confronting local norms?
Thanks, Leigh. Maybe because we are talking very much about access and inclusion. And I'd like, perhaps before responding to that specific question, think about when we talk about inclusiveness, I think it's so important that we don't stop at the level of access, just having access to the technologies. We also need to consider the level of use of these different technologies and services. And I can illustrate, if we go to Rwanda, for instance, right now I think we have almost universal access to 4G mobile broadband across the country. But still, only 1 in 5 Rwandans use the internet. And only 1% of the population is using the internet to buy something, a good or a service online, which has proven to be a very important tool during COVID to overcome social distancing and travel restrictions and so on. And just to connect to the discussion we had just about the financial inclusion perspective, there are millions of people who could technically use the internet or mobile money, but they are still not doing it. So there are other factors there. And these other aspects of these digital divides are at the usage level. They reflect costs, skills, literacy issues, and a lot of various trust-related matters. And I think this COVID pandemic, it has made this kind of divide so much more apparent. While we are thriving in the opportunities that digital is providing to a lot of us, especially in the richer countries, we need to find ways to bring all those countries and the parts of the countries that are trailing behind in being able to participate in the opportunities created from digital to catch up. And I think as we move increasingly into a data-driven world, this becomes even more complex and even more urgent.
I want to move to our second section, which is actually very similar to our first section, but more directly talk about bias. So in a 2018 experiment at the University of Copenhagen, secondary school kids with Danish sounding and Muslim sounding names were asked to choose one of two co-workers for a paid piecemeal task and provided information about the productivity of each candidate and their first names as a marker of ethnicity. Researchers found that discriminators from both groups, on average, were willing to forego 8% of their earnings in the second round to avoid a co-worker of the other ethnic type, and that it held for students with both Danish and Muslim names. So back to you, Himanshu. Do experiments like this suggest a limit to what public policy can do to encourage diversity and inclusion in data and technology fields? And what role perhaps does civil society and the media play, or the private sector, as Kamau was saying?
Thank you. Before I talk a little bit about civil society and private sector's role, I do want to acknowledge there are absolutely limits to what public policy alone can do. But there is good news, and you can say perhaps it's an over-optimistic view, but that's my view. The good news is I think what public policy can do is also, the limits of it are also changing, and perhaps rapidly in some areas. I'm not a public policy expert, but my understanding is there is something called an Overton window, which talks about what's possible based on public perception. What are the policymakers, the politicians willing to even try? And I believe in a lot of areas, important areas, the Overton window keeps shifting based on what the context is. And in the context of bias and discrimination, there are changes happening. And in my view, they're because of two reasons. One, more and more open debates about discrimination. COVID has really surfaced a lot on this end. Even this particular discussion is an example. All these debates are and will continue to change the public sentiment, and hopefully putting more and more pressure on the policymakers to utilize that Overton window, do more using that policy lever. And again, policy will not change everything, but I do believe it's becoming more and more powerful as a lever. Second, technology advancements are also helping. In my view, today, because we are collecting more data, because we are able to analyze more data, we are able to often highlight some of these biases more than we have been able to do in the past. When sex disaggregated data for pay was not available, nobody could make a strong case that women or people of color are systematically paid lower than the other population. But once that data starts getting collected, and it didn't take supercomputers to analyze that data, but availability of data and our ability to mine through that data is helping us every day. So I do think public policy has limits to what it can do, but thankfully, because of these trends, what can be done through that lever is expanding. So we have to continue to push and put pressure on the public policy, and let's not let the politicians and policymakers off the hook. Coming to your other part or main part of the question, civil society, absolutely, and media, absolutely a very strong, important role. In the world of data use and policies, I feel there are three players, or it's a three-legged stool. There are governments, there is private sector, and civil society. And again, I'm not letting foundations and universities off the hook, but in my view, there are these three large actors who, if they are left alone to do what they want to do, will push the data models too much in one direction or the other. For example, governments often can pull the data models or other policies towards perhaps a surveillance model. Private sector can focus too much on profitability. It's the civil society who brings the voice of the people, and in our case, voice of the poor to the table and make sure their rights and their opportunities are protected. I do feel giving too much power to any one of them alone will create a solution or a policy environment which is not good for people. And hence, all three of them need to play an important role. In fact, what I would like to share is in the world of data sharing and how do we enable data, and I'll talk a little bit more about this later in the discussion. I feel these three actors are rarely coming together at the same table. I've often seen, governments and private sector coming together, or private sector and civil society coming together. In some cases, civil society and governments coming together. We need to enable more and more collaboration between these three actors, because left alone, any one or any two of these actors are shifting the data paradigm into zones which are not very well balanced for the society. Over.
So that's a perfect segue for the next question. So we know that Black men and Black women are disproportionately incarcerated and victims of police brutality in the US. So commenting on the use of surveillance, which you just mentioned, for COVID-19 purposes in some countries, an article in Foreign Policy read, "Technology in policing might appear more benign than rogue cops or racist judges, but a look at global trends gives pause." So Katie, first question to you. Are humans who hold implicit bias able to design automated technologies that do not?
So we know that there's been AI technologies been deployed a lot more recently, and there's been a lot of media stories about these technologies being biased and throwing out biased results. And that's absolutely a cause for concern, and it should be. But also we need to recognize the important point about the data on which a lot of these technologies are trained as well. So if we just forget about the AI for a moment and just think about some human studies that have been done, there are all sorts of studies that have been done in social sciences and in law, looking at outcomes of decisions and whether they're correlated with any undesirable attributes. So there's various studies that have been done that shows a correlation between the time of your parole hearing taking place in a day, in a particular day, if you've been incarcerated and are up for parole. There's been studies that have shown that if your case is heard first thing in the morning, you may well get a more lenient outcome than if it's the last thing before lunch when people are hungry and tired and making rush decisions. So there's a whole host of studies on that, on the way humans behave, and what we absolutely don't want to do is replicate them in any AI or automated technologies where we're using machine learning and other technologies to learn from that data. We don't want those bad associations being learnt. But one good thing that can come out of these technologies is that they can show those. They might be able to show that there are these correlations coming out on these data points, and we absolutely don't want those to be part of the decision-making process in these cases. We don't want the time of day or the color of your skin or your gender being a factor in a machine learning algorithm's decision. So there's a good thing that can come out of that, that in doing these implementations, if we're training off bad data, if you like, that bad data will reveal those biases, and hopefully we can strip them out and make sure that they're not included in these technologies. But also there's been a lot of attention rightly paid to the need for having diverse teams of people working on these so that we can make sure that all those voices are being seen and being heard as part of the evaluations as well. To make sure that diverse teams produce diverse products as well that don't replicate these biases. And a really important point is on the evaluation of these technologies. So I'm a great advocate for making the data sets open, allowing other people to test them. If we test them to death, then other people will be able to see, okay, there's these undesirable results coming out, we want them stripped out. So we don't want it to be closed bits of software that can't be interrogated. We need proper evaluations that have shown that all the ethical concerns as well as the validity of the decisions coming out are ones that would be desirable. And that's a really important topic that I think is getting a lot of traction now in the AI community. And this issue of explainable AI is really important as well. There's some talks earlier on today about end users not being happy with the black box nature of the outcomes of some of the machine learning algorithms. So we need to have those explainability features to be sure ourselves that we're not getting biased outcomes from these automated technologies.
Thank you. And a follow-up, Kamau, for you. Can you share a Google view on how data and technologies have the potential to empower, to reach the poorest, the most distant farmers, et cetera, but as always can be used to disempower, for example, discriminatory surveillance? And how does Google take this into account when designing processes, and how do you balance the trade-offs?
Let me first say that Google is essentially a nation state, so far be it from me to speak on behalf of Google.
You're breaking up a little bit. Oh.
But with from that perspective, I'm not sure if you can hear me. So part of the other challenge here is Hurricane Sally is coming through here too, so I got all things going on. But the point that Himanshu raised earlier, I hope you can hear me, about the balance of the major democratic actors, so the public sector, civil society, and the private sector. And I think now, again, we need to be reflective on who has power in that balance. And in this COVID environment, again, here, at least in the United States, the private sector is, particularly the large technical companies, are the only ones that really remain standing with a viable, robust infrastructure. The municipalities and the local districts are decimated. The economies have been destroyed by the COVID environment. There's no tax base to fuel them. And civil society, depending on how you define that, is in an uproar. And so now, given that, it does seem to me that the private sector has an unusual responsibility, as I was alluding to before, to incorporate civic objectives as parallelly important to their principally financial objectives. And that said, I think that brings us to the question, Leigh, that you just asked. In terms of the kinds of access to data, the provision of data and data infrastructure to support communities broadly, that is born in part out of a proposition that says that we can do things that aren't necessarily going to be profitable, but are for the good of kind of the broad society. And there's going to be limits to that. There's going to be limits to the decisions and the investment in that, particularly against the return on that investment. And that's a question that's crass, but it always has to be asked. And then those unintended consequences that you alluded to before, it does raise the question again of who is in a position to police those things. As we've seen recently, when congressional subcommittees are looking to question Mark Zuckerberg and Sundar Pichai and so on, it's obvious that they're ill-equipped to question this technical juggernaut that's coming in front of them because they don't really understand what they're being asked to question. So there's a huge amount of asymmetry here in the power, the understanding of the data, the understanding of what technical capacities actually are. And so when companies profess to be doing particular things in the data space, there isn't really a capable external public sector policing agent to try to understand what that means, which again, I think puts an unusual burden of responsibility on the companies themselves. And then lastly, just to wrap that thought up, this issue that Katie was just alluding to, it is interesting. When you have, again, I'm using the US context, forgive me because that's where I am, but when you have a context which says that in the most advanced technical spaces that we have, it's largely homogenous, and homogeneity here is essentially white and Asian, and just being crass, so forgive me. But the question is whether or not people who are capable of developing these kinds of technologies are capable of recursive improvement. And I studied engineering, solid mechanics myself, and to me, once you put something out into the world and it comes back as being flawed, we have the wherewithal to fix it. So there's a question here as to whether or not we can trust the good intentions of people who make mistakes. And that's an outstanding question. I don't have an answer to it. But ultimately, because of this asymmetry that I'm discussing here, I think that is where we have to be able to build effective systems to kind of police and learn from the biases and detract and extract those biases as we learn about them. The willingness to do that is going to have to come from this kind of public pressure and discussion that we're having now.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, those systems are what we thought we built, right? And they're being tested and exposed. And I want to follow up on that as well, and a little bit on what you said, Katie, and get your view, Torbjörn, from sort of a non-US perspective as well. So Katie mentioned, non-representative data, Amazon mail resumes for hiring, facial recognition, not recognizing Black faces or having false positives. That we're starting to understand, and I think that's what Kamau is saying he feels can be redressed. But if you don't have the diverse teams that Katie mentioned as well, so if you don't have people sitting in the UN or at universities or at Google, are they going to be asking the right questions, and are they going to be looking at the problems and being able to prioritize those problems from their point of view versus from a population-wide point of view?
I suppose my quick answer to that is no. But maybe I can just zoom out, as you say, a little bit from the US perspective here, and maybe start by coming in from one aspect of this, just the gender thing. Because we've talked about the divide and so on, but in the gender gap, for instance, in internet use, you can see that it becomes wider the poorer the countries are. So we see the biggest gender divides in the least developed countries, or in sub-Saharan Africa, where it's much wider than in the rich world. But maybe in the gender case, maybe from your question here, it is very important also to look at the gender situation in the producer side. For instance, female students and employees are much underrepresented in all the STEM-related fields. Only 3% of students joining ICT courses across the globe are women, 3%. In the UK, only 90% of students of computer science are women. And according to some studies, women are underrepresented in emerging roles, such as in cloud computing, where only 12% of professionals are women. In engineering, the share is 15%, and in data and AI, about 26%. So these are very important areas for producing new solutions, the new technology of the world. And of course, with having fewer women involved, there will be a male bias, most likely, in doing this. But another thing is that we're also seeing in terms of leaders in tech businesses, entrepreneurship, startups in the digital field, there's a very big underrepresentation of women leadership there. And I think it's been alluded to several times here. How do we bring the various stakeholders together? You can talk about the stakeholder groups, but you can also talk about the country groups. And of course, the UN is a very important player here to bring all the nations together. But when you come to discussions about this kind of issues, it's very difficult for most of the least or the less developed countries to really take active part in the dialogue. It's very complex, it's very advanced, and it typically requires knowledge from a range of policy areas that need to be well coordinated. And I think even in developed countries, we have a problem now that the computer science community is not so well represented inside the government sector. So if you're engaging the dialogue between the government side and the private sector side, and on the private sector side, you have players like Google, Amazon, Facebook, and so on, it's hard for the private for the public sector to keep up that dialogue and be on par with the kind of in-person knowledge about what goes on. We have been trying since 2015 to bring the different stakeholder groups together in one aspect of the e-commerce and digital economy. We have called that the e-commerce week, which happens every year in Geneva. And where we have been quite successful in bringing governments, business leaders, international organizations, civil society, and academia together to enhance this cross-sectoral dialogue. It has grown from about 150 people when we started. Now it's about 1,500 to 2,000 people every time we meet. But I will use this opportunity to make a call to the community that is participating in this conference. We haven't got enough people from the computer science community, and that is essential that you become more active in the policy dialogues as everything becomes data-driven as we move forward.
Thank you. And I want to round out this section with a quick question going back to Katie. In your work on AI and the law, which it says modeling reasoning in persuasive arguments, is the hope that the more uncertainty and judgment in legal decisions, the more objective the algorithms become relative to human decision making?
So the particular area of AI that I work in is something called computational models of argument. And what we do is we look at how humans argue and debate with one another and how we persuade one another. And that needs to take into account a variety of different types of information. So we have objective facts about the world, and then we have subjective opinions. And it's quite often the subjective opinions where we disagree. And the reasons for those disagreements can just be related to well-justified individual preferences, or it can be because of different values that individuals or the groups that they subscribe to hold. So what we're trying to do in our work is model both those types of arguments. So arguments about objective information, you know, what the facts were in a legal case, you know, who was where, when, who were the witnesses in the room, and then the more subjective information. And the law is intrinsically related to values that we want to either promote or to demote, and we try to model those arguments as well. So we're building models of legal reasoning where we want to take into account both objective information and subjective information and be able to handle those within the AI and do it in an explainable way. So you would expect a lawyer to be able to present arguments for why they think that their client has the winning side of the case, and then there are going to be counter arguments to those. What we do in law is we weigh up those different arguments, see which are the winning arguments, and very importantly, why they're the winning arguments, taking into account those values. And legal decisions have been made where the judges have referred to specific values that the law wishes to uphold. And often these are the kind of cases that go to Supreme Court. So for instance, cases on capital punishment are about whether it's, you know, cruel and unusual punishment. And we have to it's the legal expert's job to work out what those mean and how to interpret those laws, but refer back to the values that we want to uphold. So that's the kind of thing that we're trying to capture in this modelling of legal arguments. And if I can just shoehorn in a question to, and a response to one of the questions that came up in the chat. So there was a question about the law, how do you envisage the amendment of legislation and legal process using data science? Well, the law has got to keep up with these changes. And there's often a lot of talk about AI replacing humans in certain jobs. What I work on is very much decision support. So I want to provide tools that are going to help people, and we've got the right checks and balances in there as well, with the human making the decision, but hopefully with the help of some of these tools as well. And the legislation is going to have to change to say, you know, what is allowed, what isn't allowed. This issue that I already mentioned about needing to have explainability of decisions, we would expect that of a human, so we should expect that of a machine supporting this process as well.
Thank you. So I want to turn to the last section on responsibility, and I want to throw this question open to everyone, and we've already touched on several parts of it. And again, apologies that it is a US example. There's far too many of them right now, so I grabbed one. On August 23rd, Jacob Blake, a Black man, was shot in the back 7 times by police in Kenosha, Wisconsin. 2 nights later, a 17-year-old white teen armed with a semi-automatic rifle shot and killed 2 protesters and injured another. CNN reported that Facebook failed to take action against a self-styled militia group that was using the platform to encourage armed citizens to take to the streets of Kenosha. Facebook CEO Mark Zuckerberg said it was largely an operational mistake. One Facebook employee apparently commented, "At what point do we take responsibility for enabling hate-filled bile to spread across our services? Anti-Semitism, conspiracy, and white supremacy reeks across our services." So Three, you can answer any part of this question, and you've already addressed some of it. One, whose responsibility is it to protect our data? There's also been several data breaches. Whose responsibility is it to regulate false, toxic, and dangerous content? And third, relating to something that's already been mentioned as well, how do we equip consumers and policymakers to understand the complexities of these technologies, or do we need to? I actually know that at least 3 of the 4 of you have already volunteered to address this. Should I just start with Himanshu?
Thank you, Leigh. I was hoping you'll not start with me because I'm, but no, that's perfectly fine. I think some of my examples, I may not directly talk about the context and Facebook in particular and the racial injustice in US. I'll give you more examples from the global. So I hate to take it away from the main theme you said, but probably the other panelists will come back to that. The points I wanted to make around whose responsibility is to protect, a few different ones. One, I'm seeing that there is often a debate between privacy and innovation that is happening in the data domain. And we need to change that. And again, I won't go into too much depth here because that will take the entire time. There are a few models which are new in nature and trying to address it. So, and the main model I want to talk about is of consumer empowerment. To me, that seems like the best way to balance the trade-off between privacy and innovation. Let uh, a consumer who's educated enough about the risks and the benefits make the trade-offs. In the world of financial services, there are 2 models or 2 different geographies. Both of these are work in progress and we still have to study them closely. These are not proven efforts, but who are taking a very consumer empowerment approach. And one of them is the open banking in Europe, and second is the data empowerment and protection architecture in India. So DEPA. Both of these efforts, which are led by the policymakers, are trying to put consumer at the center. They're trying to give more control to the consumer. They're trying to put more corporate liability around proper consent and proper security. So really letting the consumers take away the data which is useful to them away from the silos of some of the big and small companies. So that's one I would recommend that we pay more attention. All the researchers especially need to pay more attention to these data empowerment models, and I think these are the 2 most developed. There are many others. Almost every country is experimenting some version of it. The point I want to make in those is government is having to engage heavily in both of these experiments or both of these movements, both on policy and infrastructure side. Just making a policy and mandating that data should be shareable is not proving to be enough. Governments are having to go much further, establish standards for APIs, or even provide infrastructure so that nobody in the ecosystem can say this is not possible, like removing the friction to enable it. So governments are having to do more and more, not just policy, but also engage on the infrastructure front. I also want to very briefly talk about, when we say protection, some people directly go to privacy, some people go to security. There's a much broader definition, exclusion, consent, privacy, security, redressal, liability framework. So there's a very broad area of, when we talk about protection, um, and I think there is a lot more research needed, and this is where universities and philanthropic capital and a lot of new actors are needed. For example, um, I'm seeing a risk that a lot of developing nations are in a rush to copy GDPR and apply it in their context. Like, what will GDPR do in a small African nation to the innovation? Like, what would it do to the potential of using data? Like, we really have to balance both the positives and the negatives. And copy pasting a policy from one context in a different context is going to be very tricky and potentially harmful for people as well. So there's a lot more research needed. And lastly, how do we equip consumers and policymakers? I think I talked about consumers through empowerment, but on policymakers, there's a lot more education needs to happen. And one of the effective ways of educating or enabling policymakers with this information is South-South dialogue or policymakers to policymakers dialogue. Often they look up to other policymakers to learn from them. So we need to bring more policymakers within the country and across the borders together to learn from each other. And we need to be facilitating some of those discussions. So with that, over from my side. Thank you.
Thank you, Himanshu. I'd like to give other panelists the opportunity to respond to this question if they... Torbjörn.
Thank you. Just to tag on from what Himanshu just was saying there, I think it's very important just not to see that one solution will solve everything, but at the same time, with a reference to developing countries here, it's not easy for them to be in a position where the EU goes one way, the US goes in another way, and then some Asian economies go in a third way. And India has its own approach in this case. They want to be able to trade with them. They need to know that their data policies that they adopt will be compatible with what goes on in the rest of the world. For instance, if they want to be able to trade with the European Union, they are bound by certain restrictions there. And this again is another reflection of the digital divide that we see around the world. We talk in the rich countries about what is the best approach. But if you look at Africa, for instance, there is something called the Malabo Convention on Cybersecurity and Personal Data Protection under the auspices of the African Union. To date, only 8 African countries have so far ratified it. And still, only about half of African countries have the data protection and privacy policy at all in place. And if you bring in the consumer protection for online transactions, it's less than 50%. So they are really starting from scratch in this area. And that's why I think it's so important when we talk about inclusiveness here, that the world needs to help a lot of these countries to come up to the level where they can start interacting properly in the digital economy. And right now we are in a sense of at an impasse in the current state of debate with regard to international discussions on data and data flows in this area. And at the same time as data and data flows become so increasingly prominent in the global economy, there's an urgent need to properly regulate them at the international level or at the national level that is compatible for international exchange. And I think when we look for rules that can accommodate the many various development interests of countries, depending on the level of development or development priorities, it's going to be necessary to go beyond trade, which is currently the gist right now among member states, and look at this in much more holistic manner, factoring in dimensions related to human rights, national security, competition, international taxation, and overall internet governance. And this is a huge challenge, but it needs to be addressed.
Thank you. Katie, Kamau?
Yeah, I'll just make one short point that there's lots of goodwill on efforts around internet governance. So there's the Internet Governance Forum that was set up to try and bring various stakeholders together as equal parts to discuss policy issues around the internet. Tim Berners-Lee has put his weight behind the contract for the web that sets out 9 principles, and those sets of those principles are aimed at different groups, some at governments, some at companies, and some aimed at citizens. And that really shows the responsibility of everybody to play their part. So there's some things that citizens can do, some things we would expect of companies, and some things that we would expect of governments as well. So they're positive initiatives that lots of people have got behind, but then it's implementing those and making sure that people stick to those. That's the difficult bit, and the policing of that, is the hard bit. And what do you do, when somebody doesn't uphold their end of the bargain?
I wanted to offer a little reflection. I think that the governance of data and the discussion that we're having here is given who we are, it has an academic platform. It's definitely applicable to the viability and function of individual people across the world, hundreds of thousands and millions of people. But if we just pan back just for a sec and think about the similar kinds of discussions that were happening half a century ago about the ubiquitous spread of human rights around the world. And we would say, well, what's the international community's responsibility in ensuring human rights, particularly in the aftermath of World War II? And it was asymmetric. We didn't really have a structure for it. We didn't really understand what was going on, et cetera, et cetera. So here today, we're at the end of the first quarter of the 21st century. And it's interesting to me that while we're having this important dialogue about the data infrastructure, the governance, and essentially in the chat, what digital freedom means, what digital sovereignty means at the individual level, how do we aggregate that to nation states, et cetera. But at the same time, the United States, for example, in this developed and developing classification, we just watched a series of men being killed on video by race. And if those things were happening in developing countries, as it's stated, we would be up in arms and say, well, these countries in Africa, they don't really understand what civic and human rights are, and we have to get the international community to prevent agents of the state from murdering their people on videos. And we're doing that here in the United States. And so the question that I have is that as we're going about the development of a complicated, I would argue, a very complicated international policy structure on the governance of data and its applicability to human sovereignty and dignity, what have we learned from the previous round of this essentially similar effort to protect human dignity in ways where it was much more crass in the last generation than it is now? But it seems to me that given how crass it had been, that's an easier problem to solve. You can't just go raping people all over the place and using rape as a weapon of war, et cetera. However, we have allegations now in the Immigration, Customs, and Enforcement Office here in the United States of women being corralled and having their genitals removed. I mean, that's what's happening today. So my question in this reflection here is coming back again to this point that Himanshu raised. We have a private sector, a civil society, I don't even know what that means anymore, but a civil society, and the public sector. And whose mutual responsibility is it for us to be able to understand the applications of what we were trying to achieve, just let's start at the end of World War II to now, and then here going forward? And that question, to me, I honestly don't know the answer to it, but I think that has to be a critical part of the way that we're approaching this problem.
So just one quick comment. I personally used to believe that it was the public sector responsibility, and I feel strongly still about the men and women who keep our bureaucracy afloat. But I would also just like to note that it really, I think, as individuals in all these sectors, and to take note of Bill Gates Sr., passed away on Tuesday. He was a great global philanthropist. Private sector, but these people emerge and they grow, and not all foundations believe that every life has equal value. But I think, the optimism maybe is that people are rising to this occasion. We hope, at least in the US. My solution was going to be a really simplistic one, like a global book club, and everyone has to read John Rawls' Theory of Justice and understand what the veil of ignorance means. Because if we could construct our global infrastructure with that, I think we might be better off than where we are now. But I want to, this has been a phenomenally rich conversation, and I want to try and end on a bit more of a positive note, because I think for a lot of us, we're seeking that optimism, and I know, Himanshu, you are that way, which is great. But I want to end by asking EQ gives you hope around diversity and inclusion in data and policy. And I'm going to go alphabetically again. So I'll start with you, Katie.
So I think the fact that we're having these conversations openly and you're seeing it an awful lot more around various fields mean that there's a level of consciousness raising going on. So that's the first step, is raising awareness that there is a problem. Then you obviously need the actions to follow up that in order to effect change. So, you know, I'm pleased that these conversations are happening in the people who are working in these fields currently. And I think the next generation gives me hope as well. So we've got an awful lot of students who come into our university and in their schools. I know they're having these conversations a lot more openly as well. And we're seeing a lot of positive attitudes, people who want to change the world, whether it's environmental issues, you know, gender issues, poverty issues, race issues. So I'm hopeful that the conversations that we're starting off now and the consciousness raising that we're doing, we should make sure that, you know, we try and add to that conversation about actions to change things. And I'm hopeful that the next generation will pick up that mantle, and they give me optimism from talking to our students that that's going to happen.
Thank you. Kamau?
I guess at risk of sounding like I'm offering platitudes, I think what's hopeful to me is that I think our struggle for human dignity, independent of the field, whether it be data or social justice or larger policy issues, I think it's inherent in us. So our battle now, you know, it's part of the process. So I think ultimately we can't lose, because as individuals, we're always striving for something better.
Torbjörn.
Thanks. Well, I think we always have to stay positive if we are to find solutions to whatever challenges that we are facing. And there was once a wise man who said that when it rains, I look for the rainbow, and when it's dark, I look for the stars. I think it's a good saying. I think the data-driven world offers great potential as well as huge risks and challenges. And I think the only way to really seize this potential is to work together with a clear idea of where we want to go to make the outcome of these digital transformations that are only beginning, one that brings benefits to the many rather than few.
Thank you. Himanshu, last word is yours.
Thank you for putting me in a tough spot again. I feel like it's my job to be optimistic with, you know, Bill Senior's vision and legacy, and Bill and Melinda inspiring us every day. It's my job to be optimistic. I will say we are in a crazy world. Yesterday, or earlier this week, Bill and Melinda launched the Goalkeepers Report, which warned us that, you know, we might have set back 25 years of progress in 25 weeks. And sorry, I'll come to the optimistic part. But if we get away from all the, you know, divisions in the society and all the politics and all the craziness, and if I see the last 6 months, the world has come together. For example, on the vaccines front, the world has put the collective energy towards finding a vaccine and planning for distributing the vaccine. Big questions remain on equitable distribution, etc., etc. But underneath all the craziness, the world has come together in ways which I was not expecting because of so much nationalism, nationalistic. You know, a year ago, I would not have imagined world would have come together the way it is. So I think on the vaccine front, as an example, new coalitions, new international coalitions, new public-private sector coalitions, discussions we are having today, we never imagined we could have. So I think the world is really coming together, as an example on the vaccine front, which gives me hope that, yeah, we will survive this pandemic, but also come out of it stronger. So, over.
Thank you. And I would like to thank the organizers again for realizing how important this topic is within our computing world and making it the closing plenary. I agree. And I think we have some of our toughest challenges ahead, which have dogged us for years in the US in particular, with recognizing that Black lives matter and dealing with years and years and years, hundreds of them since the early 1600s of slavery. So I think that those issues are on the table. I think people are talking about them. I know we always talk about having conversations. I think a lot of people feel like it's time to go beyond that and to see actions. And I think we're seeing some actions, which gives me hope, at least in the US. The global community is all of our community, and so I am very helpful on all those fronts as well, and I appreciate those of you outside the US bringing that perspective in. And so with those optimistic remarks, I would like to say thank you and close the conference, and wish you all well, and hope that we have a chance to meet again maybe next year.